Right, and I'm sure, these purging of voters off the voter roll will not be along, economic and or racial lines. Remember, guys, if you're not voting by mail this year, there have been right-wing groups who in 2022 were showing up at the polls with assault rifles to try to intimidate voters. This is a real thing they do, so keep an eye out,
democracynow.org, War, Peace, and the Presidency. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump made headlines this week after suggesting that this year's election could be the last U.S. election if he wins in November. Trump made the comment Friday in Florida at Turning Point Action's Believers Summit.
Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You got to get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not going to have to vote.
For more on who's backing Trump's efforts, we look at a secret organization of wealthy Christians who are working to purge more than 1 million voters from the rolls in battleground states and mobilize Republican voters to back Trump. It's called ZIKLAG. The news outlets ProPublica and Documented obtained thousands of ZIKLAG's internal files and found the group has divided its 2024 activities into 3 different operations: Steeplechase, which uses churches to get out the vote, and Watchtower, which aims to rally voters around opposition to transgender rights. The third operation, called Checkmate.
The moral majority, right, guys? It is weird that they keep trying this. Of course, my assumption is something like this is going to be mostly focused on getting people not to vote, right? Like making sure there's as low a voter turnout as possible. Because it turns out, most of the country isn't motivated to come out and vote by fear-mongering to them about transgender people, right? They tried that in 2022. It backfired pretty badly. Because most people in the country, even lots of Republicans, are like, yeah, you tell them like, oh, did you know that transgenderism is spreading like the plague? And they look around and they go like, it doesn't seem like it, Then they look up some numbers and it's like, yeah, it seems like it's like 1% of the population. And also this is like a odd thing to fixate on, That's like most of the public's opinion on this. So an organization like this is mostly going to be focused on, having as low a voter turnout as they can get, so the people they have radicalized into thinking that, like, the fall of the West will come through the transgender ideology will come out and vote, and people who would normally vote against them stay home.
Focused on funding so-called election integrity groups as laid out in this ZIKLAG member strategy video.
Voter irregularities are rampant across all 50 states, but especially pronounced in the battleground states. Public polling confirms Americans have lost confidence in electoral integrity. With the federal election already in full swing, more must be done to ensure fair elections.
Hey, is that because there's all these cases of voter fraud? Which, of course, there isn't, right? We have basically no effectual voter fraud in this country. We know that, especially now, because Trump harped so much on it last time, and had 60 court cases where they found no outcome determinative voter fraud. There were, as always, some individual cases of voter fraud. And most of those were people like fucking up their voter registration, right? It wasn't people who were even trying to vote fraudulently. Do you know which registered voters were found to have committed the most voter fraud in 2020? Republicans. Yeah, that's right. It was Republicans. Yeah, we just don't have a problem with voter fraud in this country. There's just no evidence to support that. Now, do people lost faith in elections because of things like politicians being beholden to corporate interest? Yes. And that's a totally legitimate reason to lose faith in elections. But that doesn't have anything to do with voter fraud. That has to do with how we do campaign finance, right? And of course, organizations like this, Amy said in the beginning, are funded by corporate interests and billionaires, right? Like these organizations aren't opposed to members of the higher orders tipping the scales in their favor when it comes to elections, right? They actually think that they should be able to do that because they're, the aristocracy.
In the most important republic in the world. That's the purpose behind Operation Checkmate and its practical approaches to both get out the vote and clean electoral rolls through our coalition partners. Through these efforts, we have the opportunity to play a significant role in the upcoming election.
ProPublica reports ZIKLAG's mission is to take dominion over 7 spheres of public life, which it calls mountains: business, science and technology, family, arts and media, church, education, and government. For more, we continue with Andy Kroll, investigative reporter for ProPublica.
Don't you love it when like radical Christian nationalist organizations want to take over the pillars of science, Just amazing.
Recent piece inside ZIKLAG, the secret organization of wealthy Christians trying to sway the election and change the country. Andy, lay it out for us.
ZIKLAG is a secretive network of ultra-wealthy Christians, conservative Christians, who have this two-part goal, two-part vision for this country. One is to get heavily involved in the 2024 elections in the ways that you just described, mobilizing pastors, knocking people off the voting rolls, demonizing trans people to motivate conservative voters, but then looking toward the 20 and 30-year horizon, ZIKLAG's goal is nothing.
There it is, right? Motivate the people who they've already propagandized into believing every single one of their fear-monger scapegoating campaigns, but mainly focus on the low voter turnout.
Nothing less than moving the country toward a state of Christian nationalism, having biblical worldviews, quote-unquote biblical truth, shaping, influencing every part of American culture, those 7 mountains that you described. So this really is, as one expert we quoted in the story told us, a vision for Christian supremacy.
ZIKLAG mean?
Very American of them, by the way, Certainly in line with the Constitution, Just use the power of the state to enforce conservative Christian values on the public. Certainly the vision, I'm quite certain these people are constitutional literalists too, right? It's not that the Constitution itself clearly states that the state cannot establish a religion, and then every external source we have from the founding fathers writing on it say that this was meant to establish the separation of church and state, It's not like that's the case. Actually, they'll come up with some they'll twist themselves in a pretzel to tell you about how actually the vision for the country was to be a Christian nation,
ZIKLAG, the name, refers to a biblical reference about David taking refuge during his struggle with King Saul. The analogy here, of course, is that the Christians in this group apparently feel that they are under siege and that this group is their refuge, but then the place from which they plan their campaign, their assault to take back American culture.
In a ZIKLAG member briefing video that you obtained at ProPublica, one of ZIKLAG's spiritual advisors, Lance Wallnau, a Christian evangelist and influencer, laid out a plan to deliver swing states by using an anti-transgender message to motivate conservative voters who are exhausted with Trump.
If we can get the left to own their position on LGBTQ, the country's already drifted on the homosexual issue, but on transgenderism, there's a problem. And they know it. They're going to want to talk about Trump. Trump is indicted. The guy's a criminal, this and that. They're going to have riots in the street and all the kabuki theater. Meanwhile, if we talk about, it's not about Trump. It's about the parents and their children. Right. And the state is a threat. When you get Governor Newsom or Governor Whitmer or Polis, your top three potential candidates for the future presidency of the United States, other than Kamala, you got these, when they're going to have to stand with their LGBTQ donors. Right. And so when they solidify that position, that's where they've gone too far.
So,
again, not sure why they're so confident in this strategy. It did not work in 2022, They harped on it. Every candidate they had hammered this button in 2022, and they performed miserably. Also, the state is a threat, by providing healthcare to transgender people. Therefore, what we're going to do is use the power of the state to enforce our idea, which is transgender people icky. And also, make sure public schools have to let the parents know if a kid comes out as transgender, because I'm sure that won't put any kids in danger at home,
So that's Lance Wallnau, a Christian evangelist and influencer. Andy Kroll, if you can talk about him, what he's saying, and who the other leaders of this are.
Lance Wallnau is maybe one of the most important Christian evangelist figures that maybe your audience hasn't heard of. He was one of the earliest Christian right leaders to endorse Donald Trump. We're talking way back in 2015 here. He popularized this notion that Donald Trump was a modern-day Cyrus, a sort of flawed but virtuous leader who would deliver victory for Christians. And that Cyrus idea really caught on, was a big reason that evangelicals turned out to such a big degree for Trump in 16, again in 20. Wallnau remains this bridge between the Christian right, Christian nationalists.
I will give this guy credit, because what it sounds like to me is that this guy isn't really pretending that Trump is a devout Christian, right? Because a lot of them will do that. They'll say Trump is a conservative Christian guy, he has Christian values, and then meanwhile Trump is asked to give his favorite verse from the Bible, and he's like, the whole thing? I love the whole thing. He's had however many wives, cheated on all of them. Probably paid for several abortions, not a devout Christian, right? But this guy seems to be nope, he's not, but he's going to deliver for us anyways, which is more respectable. These people are ghouls, but I respect that more than the just pretending that Trump is a good Christian.
and Trump world. Wallnow is one of a number of really influential and well-known people that are part of ZIKLAG. Some members that your audience might have heard of, the Green family, they're the family behind Hobby Lobby. Obviously, they've had a pretty big impact in trying to strike down parts of the Obamacare law back in the Obama presidency. The Uline family have donated to this effort. They are, of course, the billionaire office supply family out of the Midwest, major political donors to Republicans and to Donald Trump. And then another family is the Waller family, influential in ZIKLAG. They are the owners of the Jockey Apparel Company, which probably a lot of people have heard of, even if they haven't heard of this family. So you have a number of really wealthy, really influential, conservative Christian families in this group. They have the means to invest not just in political work, but also in this larger cultural transformation plan that ZIKLAG has really really organized itself around.
Guys, election integrity is in the toilet. It's certainly not because of people like this who can just on a whim buy outsized political influence and power and like pick their preferred candidates and draft policy and all this shit and have way more influence than any regular working person does who gets one vote with no lobbying versus these people who get a vote plus lobbying. It's nothing to do with that. It's because like Venezuela sieged the voting machines and stole the election from Trump in 2020.
I don't know what's.
Andy, talk about more in depth these three programs: Checkmate, Steeplechase, and Watchtower.
Yeah, you see an almost sort of wraparound 360-degree approach to influencing the 2024 election in these three groups. So with Steeplechase, you have mobilizing conservative pastors out in America, out in the field, to mobilize their congregations to get them out to vote. And there's some concern that maybe there's fatigue about Donald Trump in 2024, that maybe conservative Christians won't turn out in the numbers they did in 2016. That's what this program is there for, getting the church as involved as possible. You have this anti-trans operation, as Lance Wallnow says in that video that you just played. They believe that going after trans people, demonizing transgender Americans, transgender healthcare can, quote unquote, deliver swing states. That's what Lance Wallnow himself said. But then this final one, I think, is honestly perhaps the most interesting, this Operation Checkmate, putting money into mobilizing conservative voters in key counties, not just states, but the counties. So Maricopa County in Arizona, Fulton County in Georgia, the other battleground counties in the country. And then trying to put money into knocking more than 1 million voters off the voting rolls in these states. And you see this in a couple of ways, but what's so interesting is how the Christian right, Christian nationalism is fusing here with the election integrity, or really the election denial movement that grew out of the 2020 election. We didn't have a lot of evidence of that before this reporting on ZIKLAG, but you see this bridge again between the Christian right and the election deniers in a really big way going into this election.
And how effective can they be in knocking voters off the rolls?
A little bit of money goes a long way when you are trying to get people knocked off the eligibility list for voters. That's what
Again, the problem isn't people like this when it comes to election integrity. The problem is essentially non-existent voter fraud. It is amazing how often and successfully they do this, right? Where they're like, they use the language of like pro-democratic sentiment, They use the language of like, the people should have an equal say in the outcomes of their elections and all this shit to motivate people to support them. But they use it in such a vague and unspecific way intentionally to propagandize them into supporting them as they do the things that actually cause elected representatives not to be responsive to their constituents.
The experts, the political consultants, the folks that know these worlds told us in the reporting for this story. ZIKLAG is putting, say, $800,000 or $1 million into something called Eagle AI, an artificial intelligence software that makes it easier to challenge the eligibility of voters en masse. So you're not doing it one by one, you're doing it by the hundreds, by the thousands. You don't need tens of millions of dollars, the experts told us, to be able to make those challenges and to sort of turbocharge the effort to make voters ineligible. You only need a few $100,000, maybe $1 million. That's what this group, ZIKLAG, appears to be doing. So it could have an effect. And we're talking about margins again in Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, margins that are a few thousand, a few tens of thousands of voters.
Right. And I'm sure, these purging of voters off the voter roll will not be along, economic and or racial lines. I'm sure they're just trying to make sure that people are registered and we don't have anybody voting who's not supposed to vote.
And Andy, how does the election officials in every state, especially in the battleground states, their cooperation with these efforts, what might that turn out in the coming election?
Well, you have two different camps here. You have the election officials in these states and in these counties who are just trying to run a free and fair election.
Remember, guys, if you're not voting by mail this year, the right, quite literally, has been found. There have been right-wing groups who in 2022 were showing up at the polls with assault rifles to try to intimidate voters. This is a real thing they do. So keep an eye out,
We've heard from those officials is that these efforts like Eagle AI or the work of the group True the Vote, another quote-unquote election integrity group, these mass challenges to the voter rolls make an already difficult job, an already stressful job, a time-consuming job, even more difficult. It's putting just more stress on the work of these local election officials, the ones who are trying to do a good job. And then you have the officials who have sort of bought into the election integrity claims, who have bought into Donald Trump's election denial for 2020 or 2022 even. And for them, they are in some places encouraging these mass challenges. And so you might see confusion, you might see chaos, you might see voters unaware that they've been removed from the rolls in these kinds of places. So it's just creating either more stress on good officials or it's creating more chaos with officials who buy into these baseless claims about election fraud.
Well, there you go, guys. Election integrity brought to you in totally good faith by right-wing billionaire dark money. They're looking out for you. And you.